In the sterile archives of the Xenobiological Research Consortium, data crystals hummed with the accumulated wisdom of 12,000 sentient species. Rows upon rows of holographic displays flickered with taxonomic precision, each containing meticulously documented predatory profiles that would make a statistical mathematician weep with joy and a field researcher develop an acute case of night terrors. The consortium prided itself on comprehensive knowledge. When they said they knew everything about predation, they meant precisely that. Everything from the silicon-based hunting packs of the Andromeda cluster to the quantum-entangled pursuit algorithms of the morphic nebula hunters. No stone had been left unturned, no ecosystem unexplored, no potential threat unclassified. Their classification system was a marvel of bureaucratic brilliance. Threat levels were calculated with such mathematical precision that even the most paranoid species would find comfort in their exhaustive risk assessments. Each predator was reduced to a series of quantifiable variables: hunting radius, metabolic efficiency, strategic complexity, psychological adaptation potential, numbers, clean, predictable, rational. Except for humans. Humans were an anomaly that consistently defied the most advanced predictive models. They appeared in the database like a statistical error, a glitch in an otherwise perfect system. Initial encounter reports read less like scientific documentation and more like fever dreams transcribed by a particularly anxious librarian. The research team responsible for human classification had long since been reassigned. Some whispered they had been quietly shuffled to remote monitoring stations on the Galactic rim. Others suggested they had simply disappeared into the bureaucratic equivalent of a black hole. Whatever the truth, their initial reports remained cryptic, fragmented, and maddeningly inconclusive. What was known about humans could be summarized in a few contradictory paragraphs. Biological classification, omnivorous mammalian species, technological development, mid-tier interstellar capability, psychological profile, unpredictable. That last descriptor was always underlined, often with multiple exclamation points that violated every standard of scientific notation. The most recent expedition report sat in a secured data vault, its contents so peculiar that it had triggered multiple review protocols. Routine planetary survey, standard xenobiological reconnaissance, minimal expected interactions. The kind of mission that in 99% of galactic exploration scenarios would result in nothing more exciting than several terabytes of geological and atmospheric data. But this was not one of those scenarios. Preliminary sensor logs suggested an encounter that defied standard threat assessment matrices. The research team had approached a marginally habitable planet, designation XR379, a rocky world with minimal indigenous life and atmospheric conditions that could charitably be described as tolerably hostile. Standard procedure dictated a comprehensive but cautious survey. What they found challenged everything in the consortium's carefully constructed understanding of predatory behavior. The planet itself was unremarkable. Granite-like rock formations, thin atmosphere, minimal vegetative cover, exactly the type of environment that typically produced survival-oriented, resource-conservative life forms. Predictable, manageable, the kind of world that research teams could survey with minimal risk and maximum efficiency. Except nothing about this mission would follow any known protocol. The first anomaly appeared in thermal imaging, a structural signature that shouldn't have existed. Not a natural formation, not a typical colonization marker, something else entirely, something that made the lead xenobiologist's neural implants flutter with an emotion remarkably close to what biological entities might call unease. Little did they know, this was merely the beginning of an encounter that would rewrite every understanding they held about predation, survival, and the truly terrifying potential of a species that approached danger with clinical detachment and an almost surgical calm. The galaxy had studied every known predator, or so they believed. Historical archives were not kind to human behavioral analysis. Each attempt to categorize the species resulted in what could only be described as a bureaucratic nervous breakdown. The consortium's xenopsychologists had filled entire data clusters with increasingly desperate attempts to understand a species that seemed to deliberately defy every known rule of rational behavior. Take territorial expansion, for instance. Most spacefaring civilizations approached colonization with mathematically precise algorithms, calculate resource potential, assess environmental compatibility, minimize risk, maximize efficiency, a process as predictable as gravitational constants. Humans. They colonized planets that made geological surveyors weep, frozen wastes, volcanic hellscapes, environments so hostile that other species would have considered suicide a more rational alternative. They didn't just survive in these locations, they seemed to thrive on the very impossibility of survival. Technological adaptation presented another conundrum. The typical progression for emerging civilizations followed a linear path. Technological development correlates directly with risk mitigation. More advanced species became more cautious, more calculated, more boring. Humans appeared to have invented an entirely different mathematical model. Their technological leaps were less about careful progression and more about what could only be described as organized chaos. They would solve complex problems with solutions so counterintuitive that it made seasoned researchers question the fundamental nature of logic itself. Consider their approach to interstellar conflict. Most species developed increasingly sophisticated defensive systems, layers of shielding, predictive engagement algorithms, weapons that could neutralize threats before those threats could even conceptualize an attack. Humans seem to view warfare as an art form, somewhere between abstract mathematics and interpretive dance. They would disable entire fleet systems using methods that defied conventional strategic thinking. A communications relay repurposed into a weapon, a mining laser transformed into a surgical strike instrument, agricultural equipment retrofitted for combat. The most disturbing reports came from diplomatic encounters. Interactions that should have resulted in immediate conflict would somehow resolve through methods that existed in some bizarre quantum state between negotiation and psychological warfare. Other species would spend decades preparing diplomatic protocols. Humans would walk into a room and fundamentally alter galactic political landscapes before anyone realized what had happened. Xenobiological profiles became increasingly frustrated. Attempts to comprehend a species that seemed to operate on principles unknown to conventional science. Threat assessment became less about measurable variables and more about a growing sense of existential uncertainty. One particularly memorable report from a Xelaxian research team described a human diplomatic mission that completely destabilized a centuries-old conflict between two technologically advanced species. The method, a series of conversations that simultaneously violated every known principle of diplomatic engagement while somehow achieving total conflict resolution. The report's final annotation, written in what could only be described as a mix of professional terror and professional admiration, simply read, "They smile. Then everything changes." Psychological profiles revealed even more unsettling patterns. Most species developed increasingly complex threat response mechanisms as they advanced. More information, more predictive capacity, more control. Humans seem to become more unpredictable with technological advancement. Their capacity for both extreme violence and extreme compassion existed in a state of constant, unresolvable tension. they could develop technologies to heal entire planetary ecosystems and simultaneously create weapons of unprecedented destructive potential. The consortium's most advanced predictive models, systems that could calculate diplomatic outcomes with 99.999% accuracy, would simply crash when attempting to model human behavior. It was as if the species had reverse-engineered the very concept of uncertainty and transformed it into a tactical advantage. Little did they know the true demonstration of human potential was yet to come. On a marginally habitable planet, in an encounter that would become legendary in xenobiological circles, humanity was about to redefine everything they thought they understood about survival, adaptation, and the true nature of predation. The mission log would later be classified under 17 different security protocols, not because of its sensitive content, but because the consortium's bureaucracy required a minimum of 16 classifications for anything that defied comprehensive explanation. Planetary Survey X R379 began as countless others had. Precision-calibrated sensors, meticulously planned approach vectors, a research vessel so standardized in its design that it could have been mass-produced from a universal template of scientific caution. Nothing suggested this mission would be anything more than another data point in the endless catalogue of routine explorations. Initial scans revealed minimal environmental complexity, atmospheric composition marginally breathable with technological augmentation, geological structure, predominantly metamorphic rock formations with minimal tectonic instability, radiation levels within intolerable parameters. A simple truth emerged that no amount of scientific language could fully contain. Humans were not just another species, they were a categorical impossibility. The review board's primary xenopsychologist, a being whose neural network could process 17 simultaneous cognitive streams, sat motionless. The holographic display flickered with fragments of data that refused to form a coherent narrative. Sensor logs, thermal imaging, gravitational anomalies. Each fragment told a story that became more incomprehensible the more closely it was examined. What had occurred on that marginally habitable planet was less a scientific encounter and more a fundamental reshaping of understood reality. The planet itself had been a test, not intentionally perhaps, but a test nonetheless, an environment designed to break down every conventional understanding of survival, adaptation, and predatory behavior. Rocky terrain, minimal resources, atmospheric conditions that would challenge even the most advanced technological augmentations. And in the middle of this impossible environment, a single human had demonstrated something far beyond mere survival. The review board's preliminary conclusions read like a fever dream of scientific uncertainty. Traditional threat assessment models completely invalid. Predictive behavioral algorithms rendered obsolete. Understanding of human capabilities fundamentally inadequate. It wasn't about physical superiority, not technological advancement, not even psychological complexity. It was something more profound, a quality that existed in the space between adaptation and pure, unadulterated potential. Whispers circulated through classified channels, not rumors, not speculation, but a growing recognition that humanity represented something entirely beyond the consortium's comprehensive understanding. Previous encounters had provided hints, diplomatic resolutions that violated every known conflict resolution protocol, technological innovations that appeared to emerge from pure conceptual chaos, a species that seemed to view impossibility as a mild inconvenience rather than a fundamental limitation. But this was different. This was a fundamental challenge to every existing scientific paradigm. The planet itself seemed to have become a living laboratory, not through intentional design, but through the sheer inexplicable interaction between human capability and environmental challenge. Geological structures that should have been immutable had shifted. Thermal signatures had danced between possibility and pure mathematical heresy. And through it all, one consistent theme emerged: a calm that defied every known principle of survival response. Most species, when confronted with extreme environmental challenges, would exhibit predictable behavioral patterns: heightened stress responses, increased metabolic activity, defensive posturing, each action a mathematical equation of survival probability. The human response? Something else entirely: clinical detachment, not the detachment of emotional suppression, but a kind of focused awareness that transformed limitation into opportunity. An almost Zen-like quality of engagement that made traditional threat assessment models look like primitive child's play. The review board's most senior researcher, who had personally catalogued over 3,000 predatory species, found herself experiencing an emotion remarkably close to professional terror. Humanity was not just another species to be studied. They were a fundamental reset of everything the scientific community thought they understood about intelligence, adaptation, and survival. The final report, buried beneath layers of quantum encryption, contained a single line that would be discussed in hushed tones for generations. Humanity does not conform to environmental challenges. Humanity recalibrates the environment to match its understanding. As the holographic displays flickered and the classified meeting drew to a close, one fundamental truth became clear. They had studied every known predator in the galaxy, and they had learned nothing. The kind of world that would make a geologist yawn and a xenobiologist consider an early retirement. The research team consisted of representatives from 3 different galactic subspecies, each selected for their exceptional ability to maintain clinical detachment. Their psychological profiles read like a manual of professional dispassion: emotional response negligible, adaptive capacity maximum, risk assessment routine. They were wrong, spectacularly, mathematically, comprehensively wrong. The first indication that something was amiss came during the preliminary ground survey. Standard protocol dictated a comprehensive but cautious approach. Remotely piloted drones would conduct initial mapping, atmospheric sampling would follow, and any potential biological signatures would be studied from a safe distance, with layers of protective analytical systems between the researchers and potential environmental threats. Except the environment had other plans. Geological sensors began reporting anomalies that defied standard computational models: rock formations that shouldn't exist, thermal signatures that violated every known principle of planetary thermodynamics. Something was watching, something was waiting. The research team's lead analyst, a being whose neural network could process 17 simultaneous data streams while composing diplomatic correspondence, felt the first tremor of something resembling biological fear. Not panic, not terror, just a subtle recalibration of existing threat assessment parameters. Something was fundamentally incorrect about this planet. Communication logs would later show a series of increasingly terse exchanges: preliminary reports, contextual analysis, mounting confusion. The kind of professional dialogue that professional researchers use when reality begins to deviate from every known scientific expectation. Anomalous thermal signature detected in grid sector 7 gamma, negative on previous scan, recalibrating sensors, negative confirmed, thermal signature persists. Then, silence. The planet itself seemed to breathe, not literally, of course, but there was a quality to the environment that suggested waiting, watching, calculating. When the first direct contact occurred, it happened with such clinical precision that the research team would later struggle to explain exactly what transpired. One moment, standard planetary survey. The next, a complete recalibration of everything they understood about survival, threat assessment, and the true nature of predatory behavior. They had studied every known predator in the galaxy, catalogued, analyzed, classified, but they had never truly understood predation. The planet's surface seemed to shift, not dramatically, not in any way that would trigger standard environmental alert systems, just a subtle realignment of geological structures that suggested something was fundamentally incorrect about the basic assumptions of planetary physics. Sensor logs would later show a series of mathematical impossibilities, thermal signatures that appeared and disappeared, gravitational anomalies that violated every known principle of planetary mechanics. The kind of data that would make a theoretical physicist simultaneously excited and terrified. What became clear with horrifying clinical precision was that the planet itself was alive in a way that defied conventional biological understanding, not a living organism in the traditional sense, but something else, something that watched, calculated, waited. And in the middle of this impossible environment, a single figure moved with a calm that would later become the stuff of xenobiological legend. No dramatic confrontation, no explosive battle, just a methodical, almost casual demonstration of survival that would fundamentally alter every understanding the consortium had about the relationship between environment, intelligence, and pure, unadulterated capability. The research team would never fully explain what happened during those critical moments. Official reports would be filed, classified, buried under layers of bureaucratic complexity. But the whispers would remain, the understanding that something fundamental had changed. They had studied every known predator in the galaxy, and they had learned nothing. The aftermath defied every known principle of scientific documentation. When the Xenobiological Research Consortium convened its most classified review board, the assembled experts found themselves confronting a fundamental crisis of understanding. 12,000 years of categorical research, millions of documented species, countless planetary surveys, and yet everything they thought they knew had been reduced to a footnote. The incident report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. 17 different security clearance levels, quantum-encrypted data clusters, sections so heavily redacted that they appeared as solid black blocks of information. Yet beneath the layers of classification,